For 10 years the sky had been burning, and neither side could win. On one mountain stood the old gods, the Titans, and on another stood the young ones, and between the two peaks lay a valley that had stopped being a valley and had become only smoke. The Titans held Othrys. The younger gods held Olympus, and for 10 years not one hand's breadth of ground had changed owner. If these long nights of old stories help you rest, a like and a subscribe keeps them coming, and I'm always glad to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now settle in, because the fire in that valley has been burning for a decade, and we are going to find out how it finally went out. Between those two mountains, the air had been beaten so many times by so much thrown stone that it no longer moved the way air should. Clouds came apart, rivers changed their courses and then changed them back. The sea, which had no part in the argument, rose anyway, because everything rose when those two houses struck at one another. Two immortal armies, evenly matched, grinding a landscape into powder. To understand why the gods were at war with their own parents, you have to go back further than the war, back past the smoke, to a wound in the first family that never healed. The sky had a name once. He was called Uranus, and he was not a place but a person, arched over the earth and pressing down upon her. And the earth beneath him was Gaia, and their children were enormous. 12 of them came first, the Titans, elemental and vast, and after them came stranger things. 3 Cyclops, each with a single eye, born knowing how to work metal the way a bird is born knowing how to fly. And 3 brothers stranger still, each with 50 heads and 100 arms, so terrible to look at that their own father could not bear the sight of them. So he hid them. He pushed them back down into the body of their mother, and sealed them there in the dark, and Gaia carried them like a stone in the chest, and she began to plan. You may already know how that ended. She made a blade of grey flint, jagged and unlovely, and she offered it to her sons, and only the youngest would take it, Cronus. He waited in the dark for his father to come down, and when the sky descended he cut, and the sky drew back forever, and the world had room to breathe for the first time. And as Uranus went, wounded, into the far heights, he left behind a sentence that would hang over everything afterward. As you have done to me, so it will be done to you. Your own child will pull you down. Cronus heard it. He never stopped hearing it. So the age of the Titans began under a shadow. Cronus took a wife, his sister Rhea, and she began to bear him children, and every time she did, he took the newborn from her arms and swallowed it whole. Hestia went down into the dark of him, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. 5 children, alive, held in a stomach that would not let them grow and would not let them die, and Rhea walked the world with empty arms and a face that gave nothing away. When she was carrying the 6th, she went to her own mother. Gaia, who had been the first to be robbed of her children, knew exactly what to tell her. Rhea went away to Crete and gave birth in secret in a cave on a mountainside, and she left the child there among nymphs and goats and the noise of armed men who danced and clashed their shields so that no cry would carry. Then she came back to her husband with a stone wrapped in cloth and held it out to him, and he took it and swallowed it without looking. That is how Zeus grew up, not in a palace, in a cave, hidden, fed on goat's milk and honey, and the whole time he was growing, the thing he was growing toward was already decided. When he came back with a poison, or a drug, or a trick, depending on which of the old singers you follow. What all of them agree on is what came up. First the stone, which Cronus vomited out whole, and which was afterwards set at Delphi as a marker so that people could go and stand next to the object that had saved the world. And then, one after another, his brothers and sisters, fully grown, alive, and extremely angry. That was the moment the war became possible. Not a war of one son against one father, but of a whole generation against a whole generation. The young gods took Olympus. Cronus and most of his brothers took Othrys, and Atlas, who was strong beyond measure and steady in a way the others were not, took command of the Titan line. Not every Titan chose that side. Themis, who was law itself, went to Olympus. So did her son Prometheus, the one who could see a little way into what was coming, which may explain everything about his choice. And then, for 10 years, nothing. Try to picture what a stalemate looks like between beings who cannot die. There are no wounded to carry off the field, because nothing that walks there can be permanently wounded. There is no starvation, no supply line to cut, no winter to wait out, no king to assassinate. There is only force meeting force, day after day, Year after year, mountains lifted and thrown and lifted again, the ground beaten to powder, and the powder beaten to nothing. Both sides equal, both sides tireless, both sides unable to imagine any outcome except more of the same. The one who broke it was not a warrior. It was Gaia, the earth herself, speaking to her grandson. She told Zeus that the war would not be won on the field, because the field was even. It would be won by remembering who was still in the ground. Down in Tartarus, in the pit below everything, the 6 monstrous brothers were still chained where Uranus had put them, and where Cronus, who had promised to free them and had not, had left them. 6 of the strongest beings ever born, unused, forgotten, and furious. So Zeus went down. There was a guardian on that prison, a creature called Campe, coiled and watchful, set there to make certain nothing came out. In the accounts that mention her, Zeus killed her, and the door that had never opened opened, and out came the 3 Cyclops blinking, and the 300-handed brothers, who had spent generations in the dark with nothing to do but wait. Zeus fed them. That detail is easy to skip past and worth stopping on. He gave them nectar and ambrosia, the food of the gods, until strength came back into bodies that had been kept alive but never nourished. And then he asked. They said yes. Of course they said yes. And the Cyclopes, who had been smiths before they were prisoners, went to work, and what they made changed everything that came after. For Zeus, the thunderbolt, which had not existed until that moment, a weapon that did not need to travel to arrive. For Poseidon, the trident, which could open the ground and open the sea. For Hades, a helmet of darkness, which did not make him strong but made him unseen. And against an enemy who cannot be killed, being unseen is worth more than being strong. Then they went back up. The last day of the titanomachy is described in the oldest surviving telling as something close to the unmaking of the world. The sea boiled, the earth cried out. The sound was so total that the deepest parts of the underworld shuddered, and the old sky, watching from wherever he had gone, must have recognized his own curse coming around a second time. Zeus did not hold anything back. Bolt after bolt came down, so many at once that the air itself caught, and the woods on both mountains burned, and the ground ran soft. And into that light came the 100-handed brothers, who did the one thing that had never been done in 10 years of even fighting. They threw 300 stones at once, not in sequence, together, a single volley from 6 hands out of 600, and then another, and another, until the Titan line was not pushed back but buried, pressed down under a weight that kept arriving and never stopped. That was the turning point, and it turned fast. What 10 years could not decide, one afternoon decided completely. The Titans were taken down into Tartarus, the same pit their allies had just come out of, and shut behind bronze gates, and the 300-handed brothers were left on the other side of those gates as guards. They had been prisoners. Now they were the wall. There is a kind of justice in that arrangement that the old poets clearly enjoyed. Atlas was given a different punishment, and a worse one, because it never ended, and it never let him rest. He had held the Titan line. Now he would hold the sky, standing at the western edge of the world with the whole weight of heaven on his shoulders, and nothing to do but hold it. Some later tellings say that Zeus, once he was secure and no longer afraid, softened and released the Titans. Others say the gates stayed shut, both endings survived, and neither one ever managed to kill the other off. Then the 3 brothers divided what they had won. They drew lots, which is a strangely ordinary way to settle the ownership of everything. Zeus took the sky, Poseidon took the sea, Hades took the world below. The earth and Olympus itself were left common ground, shared, belonging to all of them. And that, for a while, was the end of it. The war was over. The order was new. The valley between the 2 mountains cooled at last, and the smoke thinned, and the young gods sat down in a house that no one could take from them. But somebody had been watching the whole time. Somebody who had given Zeus the advice that won it, and who was now looking at her own older children shut in the dark under bronze, and thinking about what she might make next. Gaia had won her first war by proxy, and lost her second by helping the wrong grandson. She had wanted her monstrous children out of the dark. Zeus had freed them, and she had been glad. But the price of that freedom was that her elder children, the Titans, went into that same dark in their place, chained under bronze with 100 hands on the door, and the earth is not a creature that forgets a grief simply because a favor was done alongside it. She had traded one set of imprisoned children for another, and slowly, in the way that the ground shifts before anyone notices it is shifting, she began to want that trade undone. She already had the material. Long ago, when the flint blade came down on the sky and the blood of Uranus fell across the world, most of it soaked away, but not all. Where those drops struck the earth, things had grown. The Furies had come from that blood, and the nymphs of the ash trees, and something else besides, a race of enormous, aggressive, earth-born beings, and they had been waiting a very long time for somebody to tell them what they were for. The giants. Set aside, for a moment, whatever picture that word puts in your head. In the earliest images the Greeks made of them, they are not towers with legs, they are men, armored, shield and spear, fully human in shape, simply larger and stronger and impossible to reason with. Only later, a few centuries into the tradition, do the artists start giving them serpents where their legs should be, coiling and scaled, so that they seem to grow directly out of the ground they were born from. Both versions are genuinely ancient, and the later one is the one that stuck. Long hair, long beards, snake below the waist, and a face with nothing behind it but the desire to pull the sky down. Their mother sent them, and they went. The assault on Olympus did not begin with a challenge or a demand. It began with the horizon-changing shape. The giants came out of the burning country, out of Phlegra, out of the peninsula of Pallene, and they came throwing. Not arrows, not spears. They tore rocks out of the earth and heated them until they glowed and threw them upward at the house of the gods, and they pulled whole oaks out by the root, set them alight, and hurled them flaming into the sky. Two of them, in a version of the story that circulated separately, went about it differently and more patiently, and set out to build a staircase by stacking one mountain range on top of another until they could simply walk up. The gods came out to meet them, and for the first time since the Titans fell, the gods found themselves in trouble. Here is the difficulty they had not anticipated. The giants could not be killed by gods, not weakened by them, not driven off by them, but not killed. There was an oracle, and the oracle was specific and unhelpful in equal measure. No giant would fall to a god's hand, but with a mortal fighting alongside them, the gods would win. A mortal, after everything, the order that had taken 10 years and the unmaking of 2 mountains to establish now depended on somebody who would be dead in 50 years anyway. Gaia heard the same oracle, because she heard most things, and she moved first. Somewhere in the world there grew a plant that would make her sons proof against exactly that danger, a herb that would cancel the loophole, and she went looking for it in the dark before dawn. And Zeus did something that tells you more about him than any battle does. He did not race her to it, he forbade the dawn. He gave the order to Eos, who brings the morning, and to Selene, who is the moon, and to Helios, who is the sun, and all 3 of them stopped. No light rose, no light set, the world held still in a grey that belonged to no hour, and while the mother of the earth was searching by feel in a darkness she had never had to search in before, Zeus went out himself and harvested every stem of it, all of it. He left her nothing. Then he told Athena to go and get Heracles. Consider what that summons must have felt like from the other side, a man who had spent his life being punished, being set impossible tasks by smaller men, being driven mad and made to pay for what the madness did. And now the goddess arrives, and the message is not another labor. It is that the gods cannot finish this without him. He came, and he brought the bow. The fighting, once it began in earnest, was less a battle line than a great many private murders happening simultaneously across a burning plain, and the old accounts read almost like a list, which is exactly how the Greeks liked to remember it, because every name was a story somebody's town could claim. Heracles started with Alcyoneus, the eldest and one of the 2 strongest, and he shot him, and Alcyoneus went down, and then Alcyoneus began to get up again. That was the second unpleasant surprise. This giant could not die on the soil of Pallene, where he had been born. The ground itself was feeding him. Every time he touched it, he began again, and it was Athena, standing close, who saw it before Heracles did and told him what to do. And Heracles took hold of that enormous body and dragged it, slowly, over the boundary of that land, out past the edge of the earth that loved him. And there he shot him a second time, and this time it held. Porphyrion was the other great one, and he was the giant's king, and he went for Heracles directly, and had he simply kept going he might have finished the war then and there. But Zeus reached into him and put a sudden consuming lust for Hera in his mind, and Porphyrion turned aside from the fight he was winning to seize the queen of the gods instead. Her robes tore, she cried out, and in the instant that his attention was entirely somewhere else, the thunderbolt came down on him, and an arrow came in behind it, and between the 2 of them he fell. Another tradition, older in some ways, says it was Apollo who killed him with a single arrow and gives him the same title, King of the Giants. Both accounts were told, and neither cancels the other. After that, it becomes the roll call. Ephialtes took an arrow from Apollo in the left eye and an arrow from Heracles in the right, blinded twice over in the same breath. Dionysus killed Eurytus with the pine cone staff he carried, which is one of the more surprising weapons ever to end a life. Hecate came at Clytius with torches. Hephaestus, the smith, threw molten metal, still glowing, at Mimas. Poseidon chased polyboats across the sea and broke off a piece of the island of Kos and threw it after him, and it landed on him and became the island of Nisaros, and he is under it. Athena drove her chariot straight at Enceladus, and when he broke and ran, she picked up Sicily and threw it, and he is under that. When the ground shakes there and the mountain throws fire, the old explanation was simply that Enceladus had rolled over. And behind all of them came Heracles, finishing. That is the detail the ancient writers keep returning to. The gods could wound but not kill. So the pattern of the whole battle was that a god struck a giant down and then stood back, and the mortal walked up and put an arrow in him, and only then did it take. Not everyone came through it well. There is a strange, almost tender line in one telling that says Hephaestus fainted in the middle of the fighting, overcome, and that Helios came down in his chariot and picked him up and carried him out. And there is another that says Triton, the sea's herald, blew his shell trumpet across the field, a sound no giant had ever heard, and that some of them simply broke and ran from the noise of it. When it ended, the survivors were not imprisoned in Tartarus like the Titans. They were put under things, under islands, under volcanoes, under the weight of the world their mother had made, held down by geography. And Heracles, who had done what no god could do, went back to being a man with a great deal of unfinished business. The order held. Twice now the earth had raised an army against the sky, and twice the sky had won. But the second victory had needed a loophole, and a stolen herb, and a stopped sunrise, and a mortal with a bow. It had been closer than the first. Gaia had noticed that too. She had one child left in her, and she did not conceive this one with the sky, or with the sea, or with anything that lived above the ground. For the last of them she went down, all the way down, past the roots of the mountains, to the pit itself, to Tartarus. And what came out of that was not an army, it was one creature, and it was worse than both wars put together, Typhon, sometimes called Typhoeus, and the oldest poems treat those as two separate beings before later writers folded them into one, which is worth mentioning because it is the kind of seam you can still see in the fabric if you look. The last child of the earth, fathered by the abyss beneath the earth, and everything the giants had lacked, this one had. The description that has come down to us is not the sort of thing that can be pictured all at once, and I think that is deliberate. From the thighs upward he had the shape of a man, but on a scale that broke the comparison, because standing upright his head went past the mountains and scraped among the stars. When he stretched out his arms, one hand reached the place where the sun rises, and the other reached the place where it sets. And out of those arms grew 100 dragon heads, each one awake, each one with its own voice, and the voices did not agree. Sometimes they spoke like gods, sometimes like a bull bellowing, sometimes like a lion, sometimes like hounds, and sometimes, most unsettlingly, like a man calling your name. Below the thighs there were no legs. There were coils, immense vipers, and when they unwound they reached all the way up past his own shoulders, hissing. His whole body was feathered with wings. His hair and his beard hung loose and moved in a wind of their own making, and fire came out of his eyes. He came up out of the ground in Cilicia, and he came for Olympus, and he came throwing burning stone the way the giants had, but he did it while shouting through 100 throats and pouring fire out of his mouth. And something happened then that had never happened before and never happened again. The gods ran. They saw what was coming and they broke. They fled all the way to Egypt, and to hide themselves they took the shapes of animals, and each one of them wore a different beast, and that is how they crossed the sea, and how they stayed hidden while the sky above their own house burned. In some tellings it was Pan who saw him first and gave the warning, and who took the shape of a goat and a fish at once, hurling himself into the water. Whatever the truth of that, the fact underneath it stayed in the tradition, and was never quietly removed, and I find that remarkable. The Greeks kept the memory of a day when the Olympians panicked. Not all of them. Zeus stayed. In some accounts Athena stayed with him, and in a few she stays and shames the others into coming back. But at the center of it, the story is one god and one monster. He began at long range, the way he had against the Titans, throwing bolt after bolt into that enormous shape, and it worked. Typhon was wounded, and he gave ground, and he began to move away northeast, and Zeus followed, closing. And here Zeus made a choice that he did not need to make. He came down to close quarters, and he brought a blade with him. Not just any blade, an adamantine sickle, curved, the same shape of weapon that had ended the reign of the sky at the very beginning. They met on Mount Cassius, above the Syrian coast, and Zeus struck him down with it. And then the coils came up around him. It is a very fast reversal in the telling, and it must have been faster still in the moment. The serpent body wrapped him. However strong the king of the gods is, he was inside something much larger than himself, and the arms were pinned, and Typhon took the sickle out of his hand, and then, holding him, he cut. Not the throat, the sinews, the tendons of the hands and the tendons of the feet cut out of the body, so that nothing in him could grip and nothing in him could stand. Zeus fell and could not get up, and was not going to get up. Typhon picked him up and carried him across the water into Cilicia, to the Corycian cave, and put him down in the dark. The sinews he rolled into a bearskin and hid, and to guard both the god and the pieces of him, he set a she-dragon named Delphin, half woman and half serpent, who did not sleep. So there it was, the king of the gods, the one who had chained the Titans and thrown the giants under islands, lying in a cave in the mountains of Anatolia, with the strings of his own body in a bag on the floor beside him, and no army left above, and nothing in the world to stop the thing that had put him there. Now, this whole episode appears in the later and fuller account, and does not appear in the oldest surviving poem, where Zeus simply overwhelms Typhon with thunder, and it is done. Scholars have argued for a very long time about which came first. Some think the older poet knew the story of the severed sinews and left it out on purpose, because it made Zeus look weak at the exact moment he was supposed to look absolute. Others think it was added later, borrowed from further east, where there were much older songs about a storm god who loses to a serpent, is crippled, has to be rescued, and only then comes back and wins. I cannot tell you which of those is correct, and neither can anyone else with certainty. I can tell you that both versions were told and believed, side by side, for centuries. In the version with the cave, the rescue was a theft. Hermes went, because of course it was Hermes, and with him went a rustic goat-footed god called Aegipon, and their job was not to fight Delphin, but to get past her, which is a different discipline entirely. They stole the bearskin. They took the sinews back to the cave and fitted them into the hands and the feet of the god lying there, and something that had gone out came back, and Zeus stood up. There is another telling, later and stranger, in which it is not Hermes at all, but Cadmus, the man who would one day found Thebes, and he does it with music. He sits outside, disguised as a shepherd, and plays the pipes, and the monster, who has 100 heads and apparently 100 ears, is drawn out to listen. And Cadmus tells him the pipes are nothing, that he ought to hear what this could sound like on a lyre, except that a lyre needs strings, and he does not have any, and Typhon gives him the sinews for strings. Whichever hand you prefer, the result was the same. Zeus went back for him. He did not come down on foot the second time. He came in a chariot pulled by winged horses, and he had every bolt he owned. He caught up with Typhon on Mount Nysa, where a very odd thing had just happened. The Fates had met the monster there, and had offered him fruit, and had told him it would make him stronger. He had eaten it. It did not make him stronger. What exactly it did, the sources declined to explain, which is somehow more sinister than a clear answer would have been. From there it was a chase across the world, with the sky falling on it the whole way. Typhon ran north into Thrace, and turned and fought at Mount Haemus, and there he did what his brothers the giants had done, tearing up whole mountains and throwing them, and Zeus met each one in the air and broke it apart before it arrived, and the fragments came down as rain of stone. The thunderbolts kept landing. Typhon began to bleed, and the mountain drank it, and there is an old tradition that the mountain took its name from that blood. He broke and ran west, and Zeus drove him, and he went across the sea towards Sicily. He did not make it across. Zeus tore up the whole of Mount Etna and dropped it on him, and that is where he still is, not killed. The old poets are careful about that. Things born from the earth and the abyss do not die in any way we would recognize, so he was not ended. He was pinned, held under a mountain that presses down on him forever, and does not quite manage to keep him quiet. Ancient people looking at that mountain, smoking on the horizon, did not think of it as geology. They thought of it as a thing breathing. When it shook and threw fire, that was Typhon turning over underneath, trying, still, after everything, to get an arm free. The story ends there, and the world was safe. But I want you to notice what had actually changed. The Titans had been beaten by force. The giants had been beaten by force, plus a mortal and a trick with the sunrise. Typhon had beaten Zeus outright, and had only lost because two gods stole something back out of a cave. 3 times the earth had tried, and 3 times the sky had held, and the sky was never again quite as sure of itself as it had been. After that, the great wars go quiet for a long while. The gods stop fighting for the ownership of everything and start doing something smaller and stranger, which is meddling. And the battles that follow are not fought between mountains, they are fought in halls, and in mazes, and in forests, and in front of city gates, by people who bleed. The first of those started at a wedding. There was a king in Thessaly named Pirithous, and he was getting married, and he made the reasonable decision to invite his relatives. That is the whole cause of it, not an oracle, not a stolen goddess, not the earth conspiring in the dark, a guest list. The Lapiths were a people of northern Thessaly, horse country, and their kings were the kind of men whose names show up in half a dozen other stories as somebody's father or somebody's companion. Pirithous was one of them, said in some lines to be a son of Zeus. His bride was Hippodamia, whose name means horse tamer, and there is a bleak little joke buried in that, which the story goes on to make in full. The centaurs were invited because they were family. Both peoples traced themselves back to Ixion, by different and complicated routes, and so the horsemen of the mountains were kin to the horse-taming men of the plain, and you do not leave kin off the list. They came down out of the high ground and into the hall, and they sat at the tables among people, which was not something they often did, and there was wine. The detail that every version keeps is that the centaurs did not drink wine, they drank milk. They had no experience of the other thing at all, no habit around it, no idea of what a measure was, and nobody thought to warn them, and the cups kept coming. So what happened next was not a plot. It was a room full of enormous, powerful, half-wild beings encountering strong drink for the first time in their lives, in a confined space, at a party. They were already loud by the time the bride was brought out to be greeted by the guests. The centaur who moved first is called Eurytion in most tellings, and Eurytus in the fullest one, and there is no meaningful difference between them beyond the mouth that says the name. He got up, crossed the floor, took Hippodamia by the hair, and started dragging her toward the door. And then, all at once, the rest of them did the same. Not one attacker, but the whole company of them, each one seizing whichever woman or boy was nearest, and the hall went from a wedding to a sack in the space of a breath. Wine went over, tables went over. The sound in that room, one poet wrote, was the sound of a captured town. Among the guests was a man from Athens who happened to be sitting close, and who happened to be the closest friend Pirithous had in the world, and who happened to be Theseus. He was not armed. That is the version in the long poetic account, and it is the better one because of what he does about it. He came off his bench at Eurytion and got the bride out of his hands, and the centaur turned on him and hit him hard in the face, and Theseus staggered. And then Theseus reached for the nearest thing on the nearest table, which was an ancient mixing bowl, a great heavy vessel for wine, and he brought it down on that face with everything he had. What was left of Eurytion went down into the spilled wine and the sand, and did not get up. That was the first death. There were a great many after it. What follows in the tellings is one of the strangest battles in all of the old stories, because nobody has any proper weapons, and everybody is inside a house. The Lapiths fought with what the room gave them. Torch stands, table legs, serving dishes, antlers taken down off the wall where they had been hung as trophies. Somebody used an altar. Somebody used a burning log straight out of the hearth. Swords and spears did come out eventually, but the memorable part of it, the part that got carved onto temples for the next several hundred years, is furniture used as a weapon, and men throwing dinnerware at monsters. The centaurs, when they got outside and had room, fought with what the mountains had given them. They tore up young pines and swung them. They threw rocks. In their own country they would have won without difficulty. In a hall, with a beam over their heads and no space to turn, being twice the size of everyone else was as much a problem as an advantage. The fighting went out of the doors and across the fields and did not stop for a long time. The Lapiths lost a great many men. This is not a story where the good side wins cleanly, and the one they lost who mattered most, the one whose death is remembered when the rest of the casualty list is gone, was Caeneus. You need to know who Caeneus was, because otherwise the way he dies makes no sense at all. Caeneus had been born a girl, called Canis, the daughter of a Thessalian chieftain. Walking alone on a beach, she was seized and raped by Poseidon. Afterwards the god, pleased with himself, offered her any gift she wanted, which is the sort of gesture that says everything about him. She asked to be made a man. She said it plainly. She wanted to be something that this could never be done to again. He granted it, and then added something she had not asked for: skin that no bronze and no iron could pierce. And Canis became Caneus, and grew into one of the great warriors of the Lapiths, and had a son who later sailed with the Argonauts, and lived, and does not appear to have looked back. At the wedding, when the hall came apart, Caneus went into the middle of it and could not be stopped. Spears came off him, swords came off him. He killed centaur after centaur, 5 of them by name in the fullest account, and the ones still standing began to understand that they were up against something their weapons simply did not apply to. One of them, in a moment of real cruelty, tried the only weapon that would land, and taunted him with the name he had been born with. Caneus killed him too. So they held a council in the middle of a battle, which centaurs are not usually credited with the patience for, and one of them worked out the answer. If you cannot cut a man, you can still bury him. They went to the trees. They tore up whole pines, roots and all, and they carried them back and threw them on him. Then more. Then boulders. He was under a mound, and the mound kept growing, and he was still alive inside it, and still could not be wounded, and the weight came down and down until it drove him into the ground. Not killed, pressed out of the world. When it was over, and the pile was pulled apart, there was nothing underneath. No body. Some said he had been forced all the way down into the pit below the earth, and there is a later account, poetic and probably an invention of the poet who tells it, in which a bird with tawny golden wings comes up out of the mound as the timbers settle and flies away, and a seer who is standing there says quietly that this is him, that this is what he has become. That version is beautiful, and it is late, and I would not want to tell you it is old, but it has outlived a great many older things, which counts for something. The Lapiths won. That is the outcome, and it was expensive. The surviving centaurs broke and were driven out of Thessaly altogether, pushed northwest out of the country, and the horse people kept their land. Afterwards, the Greeks did something with this story that they did not do with most of them. They made it stand for an idea: order against disorder, the hall against the mountain, people who can sit at a table against people who cannot. They carved it onto the Parthenon, and onto temple after temple, centaur and man locked together, and every citizen who walked past knew exactly what it was supposed to mean, which was usually something about themselves and their enemies. It is worth noticing that the story does not actually support the reading very cleanly. The centaurs were invited. They were family. It was the hosts who poured the wine. There is one more thing to carry out of that hall. The man who broke the first centaur with a wine bowl did not become famous for that. Theseus was already known when he arrived at that wedding, and he was known for something he had done years earlier, in the dark, underground, on an island in the south, with no help but a length of thread, and a promise he was not going to keep. Every 9th year, a ship with black sails left Athens carrying 14 children who were not coming back. 7 boys and 7 girls, chosen from the best families in the city, walked down to the harbour with their parents behind them, and got on board, and sailed south to Crete, and were never seen again by anyone who loved them. The city had been doing this for a long time, long enough that there were families who had lost someone in one cycle and would lose someone in another, long enough that it had stopped being an emergency and become a season. Some accounts say the tribute came every 9th year, and some say every year, and the ancient writers themselves disagreed about it, so I will not pretend to settle it. What nobody disagreed about was the arithmetic, 14 at a time. To understand why a city agreed to this, you have to go back to a young man's death. Minos was king of Crete, and Crete at that time was the strongest sea power in the world, which is the part of the story that is almost certainly remembering something real. Minos had a son called Androgeos, and Androgeos travelled to Attica, and in Attica he was killed. The accounts vary on how, and several of them use the word treacherously, and at least one has him killed by a bull, which will come back around in a moment in a way that is either meaningful or a coincidence. Minos came for Athens with his fleet, and the war did not go well for the Athenians, and while it was happening, the land itself turned on them. There was famine, there was plague, the rivers dried. Whatever the Athenians had done, the gods appeared to be taking a side, and it was not theirs. So they asked what would end it, and they were told, and they agreed to the terms. The terms were the children, and the children were for the thing in the maze. The Minotaur had a proper name, Asterius, He was the son of Pasiphae, who was Minos' own wife, and of a bull that had come out of the sea, and the whole disaster had begun as a punishment aimed at Minos for a promise he had broken to Poseidon. So the monster in the labyrinth was, in the most literal terms, the king's stepson, and the maze was not a prison built for an enemy. It was a thing a family built around its own shame. Daedalus made it, the finest craftsman alive, working on commission, and what he produced was so intricate that the story goes he very nearly could not find his own way out of it afterward. Into that arrangement walked Theseus. He was the son of Aegeus, king of Athens, and he had arrived in the city relatively recently, having grown up elsewhere and made the overland journey north, killing bandits as he went, and he had already dealt with a bull once before, at Marathon. He watched the tribute being gathered, and he went to his father and said he would go with them. Aegeus did everything a father does. He argued, he begged, he pointed out that the ship had sailed 9 times before and had never once come back with anyone alive. Theseus would not be moved, so the king made him take one small precaution, and it is the detail on which the whole ending turns. The ship went out under black sails, as it always did. Aegeus gave him a white sail to carry, folded, and made him promise that if he lived, he would raise the white one on the way home, so that a man watching from the cliff would know before the ship reached the harbour. They sailed. And on Crete, when the Athenians were brought ashore and paraded past the royal house, a young woman watched them come. Ariadne was Minos's daughter, which made the thing in the maze her half-brother, a fact the story is generally too polite to dwell on. She looked at Theseus and decided, in the space of about a minute, to betray her father, her house, and her country. She went to Daedalus, who had built the thing and therefore knew the one weakness of it, and Daedalus gave her the answer, and she gave it to Theseus. A ball of thread. That is all it was. Not a weapon, not a map. A length of thread and one instruction: tie the end at the door and never let go of it. There is a variant, from a Cretan poet, in which the way out is not thread at all but light, a crown of blazing gold and gems that Ariadne had been given, worn into the dark so that he could see. That version did not survive as well, but it existed, and it is a more beautiful image than a ball of wool, and I think it deserves to be said aloud occasionally. She asked for one thing in return. Take me with you when you go. He promised. He went in at night with a sword hidden inside his tunic, because the guards searched for weapons and did not search well. He tied the thread, and then he walked into a structure designed by the cleverest man in the world specifically so that walking into it would be the last decision anyone made. We are used to imagining a maze of choices, branch after branch. It is worth knowing that the labyrinths the Greeks actually drew, on coins and on walls, are not like that at all. They have a single path, winding back on itself over and over. No forks, no wrong turns, leading inevitably to the center. If that is the shape of the thing, then the horror of it changes completely. You are not lost. You know exactly where you are going. You simply cannot stop going there, and the walk takes a very long time, and there is nothing to do while you walk but listen. At the center it was sleeping. The fight is described in about one sentence in most of the ancient sources, which is either an act of restraint or a sign that nobody thought it was the interesting part. The beast woke. It was enormous, a man's body under a bull's head, raised on nothing but human meat for 9 cycles, and it had never lost. Theseus had a short sword and no armor and no room. They went at each other in the dark at the heart of a building that had been made to muffle sound. He killed it, in some tellings with the sword, in others with his hands, which the vase painters seem to prefer, because there are a great many images of a man with his fingers locked into the horns, forcing that head back and back until the neck goes. And then he turned around, and found the thread where he had left it, and followed it out. He came up out of the ground with 13 living Athenians behind him, and it was the first time in the history of that arrangement that anyone had walked back through that door. They took Ariadne, and in one account her younger sister Phaedra as well, and they went down to the ships in the dark, and either stole the Cretan vessels or holed them so that nothing could follow, and they were gone before the harbour woke. They stopped at the island of Naxos on the way home, and there the story fractures, and it has never been put back together. In the oldest version, hinted at rather than told, Ariadne dies on Naxos, and the death has something to do with Dionysus, who wanted her. In the version everyone knows, Theseus simply leaves her there. He waits until she is asleep and puts to sea, and she wakes on an empty beach and watches the sail get smaller. A later writer, uncomfortable with both of those, offers a third in which a storm drives the ship off, and he genuinely cannot get back to her, and then admits in the next breath that he does not believe it either, and is only recording it because people said it. It is the first real stain on him. Everything before Naxos is a hero's record. Everything after it is more complicated. And then, coming home, he forgot the sails. Whether it was grief, or relief, or the simple stupidity of a young man who has just done something enormous and has stopped thinking about anything smaller, the black sails stayed up. And on the headland at Sunion, an old man who had been going out to that cliff every day for a long time saw a black sail on the horizon and understood what it meant and went off the edge. That is why the sea there has the name it has. Aegeus gave it his name by falling into it. So Theseus came home a king in the same hour that he became one, and the tribute ended, and the ship that had carried the 14 was kept and repaired and kept again for centuries afterward, plank by plank, until philosophers started arguing about whether it was still the same ship, which is a different conversation entirely. It is worth saying that even in antiquity, there were people who did not believe a word of the monster. One writer records a completely deflated version, in which there is no maze and no beast at all, only a naval war, a Cretan general named Taurus, which simply means bull, a harbour whose entrance was called the Labyrinth Gate, and a night raid in which Theseus killed him, and then negotiated peace terms with a princess. Take that for what it is worth. Both stories are old. Only one of them got carved on the pottery. Theseus went on. He would fight at that wedding in Thessaly. He would go down into the underworld on an errand so ill-advised that it cost him years. And in his old age he would take an army north to Thebes to recover the bodies of 7 dead champions from a war that had ruined 2 families and a city. A war we will come to. But before Thebes there was a hunt, and it started with a farmer forgetting something. The harvest had been good in Calydon that year, and the king went out to give thanks, and he thanked everyone except one. Oeneus ruled that country in Aetolia, and his name is bound up with wine, and by every account he was not a cruel man or a proud one. What he was, on that particular morning, was forgetful. He made his offerings of the first fruits of the year to all the gods in turn, and somewhere in the middle of a long list, Artemis was left out. That is the entire offence, not blasphemy, not defiance, an omission. The old stories are relentless on this point, and they never soften it. There is no negotiation, no messenger sent to warn him, no chance to correct the oversight. The goddess of the wild simply reached into the wild and sent something out of it. What came into the ploughed land of Calydon was a boar, and calling it a boar undersells the thing badly. It was described as larger than a bull, with eyes that held fire in them, bristles standing up along its spine like a row of spears, and tusks the size of an elephant's. Its breath scorched the leaves off branches as it went past. It came down out of the hills into the vineyards, and it did not eat the crops, it destroyed them, tearing the vines out with the roots still attached, flattening the standing grain. And when it came to the herds, it killed them and left them. Dogs would not face it. Men who went out to face it did not come back. A country cannot survive that. Not for a season. Fields do not grow back in time. So Aeneas sent word out across the whole of Greece, and the word was an invitation. Come and hunt the thing, and whoever kills it may keep the hide and the tusks. It is a small prize for an enormous risk, and that tells you what it was really about. Nobody came for the leather, they came because everyone else was coming. What arrived at Calydon was the closest thing that generation had to an assembly of all its heroes at once, and the guest list overlaps so heavily with the crew of the Argo that the 2 stories keep borrowing names from each other. Meleager, the king's own son, who had gathered them. Peleus and Telamon, brothers, both of whom would father sons whose names outlived their own. Castor and Polydeuces, the twins. Jason. Theseus and Pirithous, still inseparable. Idas and Lynceus. Nestor, who was young then, and who would live long enough to be the old man telling everybody about it at Troy. Admetus. Amphiaraus, the seer from Argos, who could see what was coming, and came anyway. Ancaeus of Arcadia with his great axe. 2 of Meleager's uncles, Plexippus and Toxius, his mother's brothers. And Atalanta. She came out of Arcadia, and she came alone. She had been left on a hillside as an infant by a father who wanted a son, and she had been suckled by a bear, and she had grown up in the woods and was faster on her feet than anything with 2 legs had a right to be, and she hunted for a living, and she was sworn to Artemis. She arrived carrying a bow, and the hunt nearly fell apart before it started, because a number of the men refused to go into the field with a woman. 2 of them led the objection, and it was not a quiet one. They said what men in that position always say, that it was improper, that it was beneath them, that she would be in the way. Meleager, who had taken one look at her and lost his footing entirely, argued them down, and would not let it go until they gave in, and they went, still angry. There is a tradition, and I think it is the sharpest thing in the whole story, that says Artemis sent Atalanta herself. That the goddess who had sent the boar to punish one man also sent the huntress, knowing precisely what a woman with a bow would do to a company of proud men, and that the boar was only ever half the weapon. They found it in a marshy hollow full of willow and standing water, and they went in with the dogs and the nets in a line, and the thing came out of the reeds at them. The first man it reached, it opened. 2 more went down almost immediately. A hunter called Nestor put his spear butt into the ground and vaulted himself up into a tree, which is an unglamorous thing for a hero to do, and is also the reason he was still alive decades later to tell anyone about it. Someone's javelin went wide and killed one of the hunting party by accident. Ancaeus, who had said loudly that he did not need help from any goddess and would take the animal himself, walked forward with his axe raised over his head, and the boar came up under the axe and under his guard and killed him where he stood. The formation broke. Spears went into trees. Men were running and shouting and getting in one another's way, and the boar was moving through them, and for a few minutes Calydon was very close to losing every hero in Greece in a single wet field. And then an arrow went into it, behind the ear, and stuck. Atalanta had drawn first blood, not a killing shot, but the first wound anybody had put in that animal, and it slowed, and it turned, and it began to bleed. That was the turning point of the hunt, and, though nobody knew it yet, the turning point of several lives. Because in the confusion that followed, one more spear went in, and then Meleager was on it, and he drove his weapon down through the shoulder and into the heart, and the thing that had emptied a kingdom went over into the mud and stopped. And then Meleager did the generous thing. He cut the hide free, and he carried it to Atalanta, and he put it in her hands, because she had drawn first blood, and because he was in love with her, and because both of those were true at once, and he did not particularly care which one people thought it was. The silence that followed lasted about as long as it takes to understand an insult. His uncles moved first. They said what they had been saying since she arrived, only louder now, and with a prize attached. That the hide belonged to the family, if Meleager would not keep it. That he had been made a fool of by a girl. That no woman was going to carry that skin out of Calydon, and they took it off her. In one account, they simply tore it out of her hands in front of everybody. In another, colder version, they let her leave and then ambushed her on the road home to Arcadia, and robbed her there. Meleager killed them both. Not in a duel, not after deliberation. He went through his own mother's brothers in the space of a few heartbeats, put his sword through one and cut down the other as he turned, and stood there afterward in a field full of the greatest men in Greece, with 2 dead relatives at his feet, and a bloody boarskin on the ground between them. And a long way off, in the palace, his mother was being told. Althea had a box. She had kept it for many years, and she had never opened it in front of anyone. When Meleager was 7 days old, the fates had come to the house, the way they occasionally did, and had stood over the cradle and said what he was. He would live, they said, exactly as long as the log burning on the hearth. When that piece of wood was consumed, he would be finished with it. His mother had gone to the fire and pulled the brand out with her hands and beaten out the flame and shut it in a chest. And her son had grown up untouchable, not invulnerable in the way Caeneus was, but unkillable in a stranger and more bureaucratic sense, because nothing in the world could end him while a scrap of half-burnt wood sat in a box in a room upstairs. She heard that her son had killed her brothers, and she went upstairs and she opened the chest. The accounts describe her standing at the hearth for a long time, moving the brand toward the fire and away from it, calling herself a mother in one breath and a sister in the next, and there is a version of that speech that runs for pages and is one of the most uncomfortable things in ancient poetry, because it is a woman arguing with herself in real time about whether to murder her own child. She put it in the fire. Out in the field, Meleager began to burn from the inside with no fire on him. He did not know what it was. He fell down in front of all of them, and the greatest heroes of the age stood around a young man dying of nothing at all, and none of them could do a thing about it, and it took exactly as long as it takes a piece of wood to go to ash. When it was over, Althea understood what she had done, and she did not live long after it. That is the version the poets kept. There is an older one, and it deserves saying, because it is completely different in mechanics and identical in meaning. In the oldest telling, there is no magic brand at all. The hunt ends, the quarrel over the hide turns into an actual war between Calydon and the neighbouring people. Meleager kills a maternal uncle in that war, and his mother, grieving, kneels down and beats her hands on the ground and calls on the powers below the earth to kill her son. And they hear her, and he dies in the fighting. No enchanted wood, just a curse from a mother, which was apparently enough. Both versions ended the same house. Artemis got everything she came for. One man forgot a sacrifice, and by the end of it, his country was ruined. His brothers-in-law were dead, his son was dead, and his wife was dead. Atalanta went home with nothing, and she is the only person in the story who did not deserve any of it. Two of the men who stood in that field would go on to a war that made this one look small. Amphiaraus the seer had come to Calydon, knowing more than he said. And a young man who was not yet born, Atalanta's own son, would one day march with him against a city with 7 gates, on behalf of a family that had been cursed even more thoroughly than the house of Oeneus. The curse on Thebes did not begin with the brothers. By the time it reached them, it had already been running for 3 generations and had learned exactly how to work. You know some of it. A king of Thebes named Laius was told not to have a son, and had one anyway, and put the infant out on a mountain with its ankles pinned to make certain. The child lived. The child grew up somewhere else, heard the same prophecy about himself, ran away from the people he believed were his parents in order to escape it, and on a narrow road killed a stranger in a quarrel about right of way. Then he came to Thebes, answered a riddle that had been strangling the city, was given the throne and the widowed queen as a reward, and had 4 children with her. When Oedipus found out what he had actually done, he put out his own eyes. And then, some while later, in the ugly aftermath of all that, his 2 sons treated him badly. The details vary and none of them are flattering. They shut him away. They gave him the wrong portion at a sacrifice, deliberately, as a slight. Whatever the exact insult, the blind old man turned on his own children and cursed them, and the curse was precise. They would divide their inheritance by the sword. The inheritance was Thebes. Eteocles and Polynices, having heard that said aloud by a father who had rather a good record for prophecy coming true, made a sensible arrangement specifically to avoid it. They would not divide the kingdom at all. They would share it 1 year each, turn and turn about, and hand it over cleanly at the end of every term. Eteocles took the 1st year. At the end of the 1st year he did not step down. He kept the throne and drove his brother out of the city, and Polynices went into exile with nothing. That is the cause of the war. A man who would not get up out of a chair. Polynices went south, to Argos, and arrived at the palace of King Adrastus in the middle of the night, at the same moment as another exile, a hard-handed man from Calydon named Tydeus, who had killed a relative and could not go home either. The 2 of them fought each other in the doorway in the dark, over nothing, because that is what men in their situation did. Adrastus came out with a torch and separated them, and looked at the devices they were carrying, a lion and a boar, and remembered an oracle he had been given about marrying his daughters to a lion and a boar, and decided on the spot that this was it. So both exiles married Argive princesses, and Adrastus, who was now father-in-law to 2 furious men, agreed to put an army in the field to put Polynices back on the throne of Thebes. They gathered 7 champions to lead it, 1 for each of the 7 gates of the city. The lists differ slightly depending on who is counting, and the disagreement is mostly about whether Adrastus himself is one of the 7 or the man in overall command standing outside the number. The names that appear in nearly all versions are Polynices, Tydeus, Capaneus, Hippomedon, Parthenopeus, and Amphiaraus, with Adrastus or a champion called Eteocles filling the last place. Parthenopeus was Atalanta's son. He was the youngest of them, beautiful, and much too young to be there. And Amphiaraus was the problem. He was a seer, and he was a good one, and he did not need to consult anything. He looked at the expedition, and he knew, with total clarity, that every one of the 7, except Adrastus, would die at Thebes, including himself. He said so. He refused to go. He hid. His wife was called Eriphyle. Long before, Amphiaraus and Adrastus had quarreled, and then made peace, and part of the settlement had been an agreement that any future dispute between them would be decided by Eriphyle, and that both men would abide by whatever she said. It was meant to be a guarantee of harmony. It became the mechanism of a murder. Polynices had brought one thing out of Thebes with him when he was exiled: a necklace. Not just jewelry, but the necklace that Hephaestus himself had made, and that had come down through the Theban royal house from the very beginning, and which carried a curse of its own, and which brought ruin to every woman who wore it. He gave it to Eriphyle, and Eriphyle exercised her right to settle the argument, and settled it against her own husband. He went. He had to. He had sworn. And on the morning he left, he took his son aside and gave him an instruction to carry for the rest of his life, which was to kill his mother when he came of age, and then to march on Thebes a second time. That is the sort of family the story is dealing with. They marched north. On the way, they stopped at Nemea for water and asked a woman minding a baby to show them the spring, and while she was showing them, a serpent killed the child. The 7 buried him and held funeral games in his honor, and those games kept being held every few years afterward for centuries. An entire athletic festival grew out of a moment of ordinary carelessness on a march. Amphiaraus, watching that, said that it was a sign and named the dead infant with a word meaning the beginning of doom. Nobody turned back. At Thebes, they sent Tydeus ahead alone to try negotiation, which failed, as it was always going to. Then they took up positions, 1 champion to each gate, and inside the walls, Eteocles walked the circuit and assigned a Theban defender to face each one. The account of that assignment is one of the great slow-burning passages in ancient drama, and it works because nothing happens in it. A scout comes in and describes an attacker, his bearing, his boasting, and the device painted on his shield, and the king answers each description by naming the man he will send against him, and explaining why that particular man will beat that particular device. It is a war being fought entirely in words, gate by gate, while the audience counts down and knows perfectly well what waits at the 7th. Capaneus was at one of those gates, and Capaneus is the one worth pausing on. He was enormous, and he had a mouth on him. His shield showed a naked man carrying fire, and written across it in gold were the words that he would burn the city. And he said out loud, in front of witnesses, that he would take Thebes whether the gods willed it or not, and that if Zeus himself came down onto the plain to stop him, it would make no difference, and that the lightning of Zeus was nothing worse to him than the heat of a summer noon. He got a ladder against the wall. He was climbing it, and he was nearly over the top, and he was still shouting. The bolt came down and took him off the ladder, and what came back down was on fire. That was the moment the assault broke. The Argives, who had watched their loudest and strongest man reduced to a smoking shape at the foot of their own siege ladder, wavered, and the Thebans came out at them, and the attack came apart along the whole wall. The others went one by one. Tydeus was mortally wounded by a Theban called Melanippus, and killed him before he fell. And then Athena, who had loved Tydeus, came down out of the sky carrying a drug that would have made him immortal, a gift she had gone and asked for on his behalf. She arrived to find him on the ground with the head of Melanippus in his hands, splitting it open and eating the brains. She stopped where she was. She looked at him. She took the immortality away with her and left him to die. Amphiaraus fought until the line was gone, and then ran with the enemy behind him along the river, and Zeus opened the ground in front of him. The earth simply split, and horses and chariot and man went down into it, and it closed. He was not killed. He went down alive, and afterward there was an oracle at that spot, and people came for hundreds of years to sleep on the ground there and ask a buried prophet questions in their dreams. And at the 7th gate the brothers met. It was not an accident of the battle. Eteocles knew who was at that gate before he went there. When the scout named the 7th attacker, the king stopped and heard his father's voice, and understood what the whole arrangement of the assault had been building toward. 7 gates, 7 champions, and the arithmetic leaving exactly 1 place for each brother. The women of Thebes begged him not to go. He went. They killed each other. There is no clever detail here, no trick, no god at the elbow. 2 men who had grown up in the same rooms put their spears into one another at the same moment and fell together in the gateway, and the curse was fulfilled to the letter. The inheritance was divided by the sword, and neither of them got any of it. Of the 7, only Adrastus came out. He escaped on the back of a horse called Arion, which was no ordinary animal, and he rode home to Argos alone with the news, an old man who had raised an army for a son-in-law and brought back nobody. Thebes had won, and then Thebes did the thing that undid the victory. The Thebans refused to allow the Argive dead to be buried. They left the bodies on the plain, in the sun, and posted men to keep the families away, and that refusal generated everything that followed. Inside the city it produced the quarrel that killed the last of the line, when a daughter of Oedipus went out and put dust on her brother's body with her hands because the law said she must not, and was walled up alive for it. And outside the city it brought an army. Theseus came up from Athens. He was old by then, and this was one of the last things he did, and he did not come to sack Thebes. He came to recover corpses. He marched an Athenian force to the walls, took the bodies of the 7, and gave them back to the people who had been waiting for them. 10 years later, the sons came. They were called the Epigoni, the ones born after, and they had grown up on a single story. Amphiaraus's son kept the promise his father had extracted from him, both halves of it, the terrible one at home and the other one on the road. They marched on Thebes a second time with Adrastus, now very old, at their head. And this time it worked. The Thebans were beaten in the field, and a seer inside the city told them plainly that it was over. And they left in the night, the whole population walking out of the gates in the dark and abandoning the place. The Epigoni entered a city with nobody in it. Adrastus, the only man who had survived the first war, did not survive the second. He died on the road home, of grief, having lost his son. That generation was finished, and the men who came home from that second Theban war, and the sons of the men who had died at the first one, were the same generation that would very shortly be putting ships in the water on the eastern side of Greece for something considerably larger. The last great war began, as several of these have, with a guest who was not invited. There was a wedding on Mount Pelion. A mortal man named Peleus was marrying a sea goddess named Thetis, which was not the usual arrangement, and it had come about because there was a prophecy hanging over Thetis. Any son she bore would be greater than his father. Zeus had wanted her, so had Poseidon. Both of them heard that prophecy, and both of them, having personally watched what happens when a son turns out greater than his father, stepped back very quickly and married her off to a mortal instead, where the danger would be somebody else's problem. Every god was invited to the wedding, except one. Eris, who is discord, was left off the list, for the obvious reason that inviting discord to a wedding tends not to improve it. She came anyway, and she did not stay. She threw one object into the middle of the hall and left, a golden apple with 3 words cut into it, for the fairest. 3 goddesses reached for it, Hera, Athena, Aphrodite, and nobody in that room, up to and including the king of the gods, was prepared to say which of them it belonged to, because 2 of them were going to be furious with whoever decided. So Zeus did the thing that rulers do with impossible decisions. He handed it downward. There was a young man tending herds on the slopes of Mount Ida above Troy, a prince of that city who had been raised away from it, and his name was Paris. Hermes brought the 3 of them to him on the mountainside and told him to choose. They did not simply stand and let him look. Each of them offered him something. Hera offered power, dominion over the great kingdoms of the East. Athena offered him victory in war and skill, and never to be beaten in a fight. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. He took the woman. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, and Helen was already married. She had been married for a while, in fact, and the way that marriage had been arranged is the reason the war became a world war instead of a raid. When Helen came of age, every eligible king and prince in Greece turned up as a suitor, and the man responsible for choosing was terrified, because whoever he picked would leave him with a great many armed and insulted rivals. It was Odysseus of Ithaca who found the way out. He proposed that before any choice was announced, every single suitor should be made to swear a binding oath that they would accept the outcome, and more than that if anyone ever took Helen from her chosen husband, all of them would go, together, and get her back. They all swore it. Then the choice was made, and it was Menelaus of Sparta, and everybody went home apparently satisfied. So when Paris came to Sparta as a guest, and was received in Menelaus's own house, and ate at his table, and then left with his wife, the situation that resulted was not a private grievance, it was a contract, signed by every ruler in Greece, coming due all at once. There was also the other thing he had broken, and to Greek ears it was the graver of the 2. He had been a guest, he had been given food and shelter and safety under a man's roof, and he had repaid it by robbing that roof. That relationship was sacred, and it was Zeus himself who was supposed to protect it. Whatever else the Trojan War was about, it began with a violation that the king of the gods was personally obliged to punish. They gathered at Aulis, 1,000 ships, or something close to it, and the muster is one of the oldest and most carefully preserved lists in Greek poetry, kingdom by kingdom, contingent by contingent, because the descendants of those men were still living in those places and still cared very much how many ships their ancestors had sent. Agamemnon of Mycenae, Menelaus's brother, commanded. Odysseus came, having tried to avoid it and been caught out. Achilles came, the son of that same wedding on Mount Pelion, the son who was greater than his father, brought out of hiding at the last moment. Ajax the Great, Diomedes, Nestor, who was already old and had been at the boar hunt. And the fleet could not sail, because there was no wind, and the reason there was no wind was that Agamemnon had offended Artemis. The price she named was his daughter. He paid it. He sent for Iphigenia on the pretext of a marriage to Achilles, and he killed her on an altar at Aulis so that the wind would come. In one tradition, the goddess snatched her away at the last instant and put a deer in her place, and the girl lived out her life elsewhere as a priestess. In the tradition that mattered most for what came afterward, the knife went in, and a queen back in Mycenae was told about it, and began, very patiently, to wait. The wind came. They sailed, and then, for 9 years, almost nothing happened. That is the part that gets left out of the retellings, and it is the part that shaped everything. Troy was not stormed. Troy was not besieged in any sense that would starve it, because Troy had a harbour and allies inland and could be resupplied, and the walls were the best in the world and had been built, so people said, by 2 gods working under contract. The Greeks could not get in. The Trojans could not push them into the sea. So the war became a routine. They raided. They went up and down the coast and took the smaller towns, one after another, for grain and cattle and slaves, and came back and fought in the plain when the Trojans came out, and went back to the ships at evening. 9 years of that. Men who had come out as young men were not young. Children had been born in the camp. There were market arrangements, and a burial ground, and paths worn between the tents. Both sides had long since stopped being able to remember the war as being about a woman. And in the 10th year, the thing that finally broke the stalemate was not a battle. It was an argument about a girl between 2 Greeks. Agamemnon had taken a captive in one of those raids who turned out to be the daughter of a priest of Apollo. The priest came to the camp with ransom and was sent away rudely, and prayed, and Apollo shot plague into the Greek army for 9 days, mules and dogs first, then men, until the pyres were burning day and night. When the assembly finally forced Agamemnon to give her back, he took a captive of Achilles's instead, to make the point that he was still in charge. Achilles walked away. He took the best fighting force in the army back to his own ships and stopped, and he asked his mother, the sea goddess, to go to Zeus and arrange for the Greeks to start losing, so that they would understand exactly what he was worth. She did, and they did. Everything that follows, the whole catastrophe, comes out of that. The Trojans pushed the Greeks back off the plain, back through their own wall, all the way down to the water. Fire got into the ships. Men who had held that beach for 9 years were fighting on the sand with their backs to the sea and nowhere left to fall back to. And Achilles sat and watched it and would not move. What finally moved him was not an apology. It was his closest friend coming to him with tears on his face, asking to borrow his armor. Patroclus had been with Achilles since they were boys. He was older and gentler, and the one person in the camp who could say anything at all to the man who would not listen to kings. He came and said that the army was dying. He named the wounded. He said that if Achilles would not fight, then let him go out in Achilles' armor, so that the Trojans would see that shape coming across the plain and break the way they always broke when they saw it, just to push them back off the ships, just that far. Achilles agreed, and he gave one instruction, and the instruction was clear and it was repeated. Drive them off the ships and then come back. Do not go to the walls. The armor went on and the Myrmidons went out, and it worked exactly as predicted. The Trojans saw that helmet and that shield in the smoke and assumed the worst, and the whole line came apart, and the fire on the ships went out, and the fighting went back across the plain the way it had come. And Patroclus did not come back. He kept going. He killed a great many men in that push, including an ally of Troy who was a son of Zeus, and Zeus watched it happen and allowed it. And he went on until he was at the wall of the city itself, and he got his hands on the stonework and started to climb it 3 times, and 3 times something pushed him off. On the 4th attempt, a voice told him to stop, and he did. Apollo came into the fight then, unseen, and struck him between the shoulders, and the helmet came off his head and rolled under the horse's feet, and the spear in his hand broke, and the shield strap parted, and the corselet came loose. In the space of a few seconds, a fully armed man was standing in the middle of a battlefield wearing nothing that worked. A Trojan called Euphorbus put a spear in his back, and then Hector walked up and finished it. Hector took the armor off the body. It was Achilles' armor. He put it on. It took a long time for the news to reach the ships, and the man who carried it said it in as few words as he could manage. When Achilles heard it, he went down onto the ground and put dust on his own head with both hands and made a sound that his mother heard from the bottom of the sea. There is a version of grief that turns into resolve, and there is a version that turns into something else. This was the second kind. Thetis went to Hephaestus and had new armor made overnight, and the making of that shield is described at a length that is entirely out of proportion to its usefulness in a fight, because it has a whole world on it. 2 cities, one at peace and one at war, a wedding with torches, a lawsuit in a marketplace, 2 men arguing over a blood price with the elders sitting in a circle, ploughing, harvest, a vineyard with children carrying grapes in baskets, dancing, all of it worked in metal, all of it the life these men were not living, hung on the arm of the man who was about to do the worst thing in the poem. He came out at dawn and he did not stop. What happened that day is not really a battle. The Trojan line does not hold anywhere. He killed until the plain was empty in front of him, and then he drove the survivors into the river and killed them in the water until the river was choked with bodies and the current could not move. And then the river itself rose against him. The god of it stood up out of his own water and came at him in a wall, and Achilles ran, and the flood came after him across open ground, and he was very nearly drowned by a landscape before another god put fire into the water and drove it back down. By the time he reached the walls, everything living outside them had gone in through the gates. Everything except one man. Hector stayed outside. His father called down from the wall and begged him to come in. His mother called down and begged him. He had made a decision the previous evening, against advice, to keep the army camped out on the plain rather than withdraw behind the walls, and the result of that decision had been the slaughter of the day, and he could not now walk in through the gate in front of the men whose brothers were lying out there because of him. He said as much to himself, out loud, standing there. He thought about it properly. He considered going out to meet Achilles and offering terms, offering Helen back, offering half of everything in the city, and then understood that there would be no conversation, that the man coming toward him would kill him while he was still talking. Then Achilles came round the corner of the wall, and Hector ran. He ran. The best fighter Troy ever produced, the one who had held that city for 10 years, turned and ran from him, and it is one of the most human moments in the whole tradition, and the poem does not judge him for it at all. They went round the city, past the lookout post, past the wild fig tree, past the wagon road, past the 2 springs where the women of Troy used to wash clothes in peacetime, one running hot and one running cold, and the poem stops in the middle of a life and death chase to tell you about the washing, because that is what is being lost. 3 times round the walls, neither man gaining, everyone on the ramparts watching and not one of them able to help, and on Olympus, Zeus said out loud that he pitied him and asked whether he might be saved. Athena told him what he already knew, that the man was already given to death, and that if he took him back now, none of the other gods would ever accept another judgment from him again. So Zeus lifted the golden scales and put a fate in each pan, one for Achilles and one for Hector, and held them up, and Hector's side went down. Apollo, who had been beside him the whole way and had been putting strength into his legs to keep him ahead, let go of him and left. Then Athena went down onto the plain, and she took the shape of Deiphobus, Hector's own brother, and she appeared at his shoulder, running with him. And she said that she had come out of the gate to stand with him, that the 2 of them together could face this. And Hector stopped running. That is what breaks the heart of it. He does not stop because his courage returns. He stops because his brother came for him. He turns around with something like gratitude, and he faces the man chasing him, and he tries to make an agreement. Let us swear, he says, whoever wins gives the body back. No mutilation. The armor to the victor, the corpse to the family. Achilles refused, and the refusal is one of the coldest things ever put in a hero's mouth. He said there are no binding oaths between lions and men. He said that wolves and lambs do not come to terms. He said, in effect, that he had stopped being the kind of creature that makes agreements. He threw first, and missed, and Hector saw it go past and knew he had missed. And Athena picked the spear up out of the ground and handed it back to Achilles, and Hector did not see her do it. Then Hector threw, and he did not miss. It struck the shield dead center, and the shield was made by a god, and the spear came off it and fell in the dirt. And he turned to his brother to ask for another one. There was nobody there. The whole plain, and nobody there. And in that half-second he understood the entire shape of what had been done to him, that he had been walked out of a chase and into a stand by a goddess wearing a face he loved, and that the gods had called him to his death, and that they had done it gently, and that there was nothing left to do about it. He said so, briefly. Then he drew his sword, because he had nothing else, and he said that he would not go without a fight, and that he would do something the people who came after would still be talking about, and he charged. Achilles knew exactly where to put the spear, because the armor Hector was wearing was his own. He had worn it for years. He knew every seam in it, and there was one gap at the throat where the neckpiece meets the breastplate, and he put the point into it as Hector came in. Hector went down and was still able to speak, and with what he had left he asked for his body. He offered gold. He said his father and mother would pay whatever was asked, only let them burn him properly at home. And Achilles said no, and said it in the ugliest possible terms, that the dogs and the birds would have him, and that no one would keep them off. Hector died telling him that the gods would remember this, and that his own death was coming, at the gates, by Paris and Apollo. Then the Greeks came in and stood around the body, and every man who came up put his own spear into it, which was a custom, and which the poem records without comment. Achilles cut through the tendons of the ankles, threaded a leather strap through, tied the body behind his chariot, and drove back to the ships with the head dragging in the dust. The sound that came off the walls of Troy when they saw it is described as the sound the city would have made if the whole place had been burning. His mother tore her veil off, his father had to be physically held back from walking out of the gate alone to beg, and his wife, who had not heard, was inside the house heating water for his bath, and came out at the noise, and got to the wall, and saw what was behind the chariot, and fainted where she stood. He kept the body for 12 days. He dragged it round the burial mound of Patroclus every morning, and it did not decay, because 2 gods would not let it, and the dragging did not mark it. What ended it was not remorse. It was an old man walking alone across a battlefield at night. Priam went to the Greek camp himself, unarmed, guided by Hermes, with a wagon of ransom, and got into the shelter of the man who had killed his son, and knelt down, and took hold of Achilles' hands, and kissed them, and asked him to think about his own father. And Achilles wept. Both of them wept, in the same room, one for a son and one for a father he was never going to see again. And then they ate together, which is the thing that had not happened in 10 years, and then Achilles gave the body back and granted 11 days of truce so that Troy could bury him. The oldest poem about the war ends there, not with the fall of the city, with a funeral. But the war did not end there, and what came to Troy next came from a long way east, and it came led by a woman. Troy had buried Hector, and had nothing left to put in the field, and then, out of the northeast, along the roads that came down from the Black Sea country, an army of women arrived. Penthesilea was their queen. She was the daughter of Ares, the war god himself, and of an Amazon called Otrera, and her sisters were the other great Amazon names that keep appearing in Greek stories, Hippolyta among them. She came to Troy with 12 named companions, and a full force behind them, foot soldiers and archers and cavalry, and she came offering to fight for a city that was 3 days from having nobody left to defend it. Why she came is the interesting part, and the sources give 2 very different answers and never reconcile them. The colder version says she was a mercenary, that she came for gold, that Priam paid, and that is the whole of it. The other version says she was running from something, out hunting. She had thrown a spear and killed her own sister Hippolyta by accident, and the guilt of it had put her in a state where she wanted to die and could not simply lie down and do it. Under the old customs, blood spilled inside a family needed a formal purification, performed by a king, and Priam had performed it for her. So she owed him, and more than that, she had found the one place in the world where a woman looking for an honourable death could go and be certain of finding one. I lean toward the second, and I want to be honest that I lean toward it because it is the better story, not because it is better attested. She went out onto the plain at first light, and she was, for a few hours, the best fighter on that field. The accounts of what she did that morning are not modest. She broke the Greek line. She drove them back across ground they had held for a decade. She killed man after man, and the names that are recorded include Machaon, who was the healer of the Greek army, the surgeon who had pulled arrowheads out of half the men there, and Podarces, the brother of the very first Greek to die at Troy 10 years earlier. The Greeks fell back to the ditch. Some of them were talking about the ships. From the walls of Troy, the people who had watched Hector dragged through the dust 12 days earlier stood and watched a foreign queen do what none of their own could do anymore, and for a little while they let themselves believe. Then 2 men came out. Ajax the Great and Achilles had been elsewhere on the field, at the burial mound, and when they came, the fight changed shape immediately. Ajax engaged the Amazons on one flank, and Achilles went straight for her. In the plainest telling of it, it took a single spear. It went through her armor and through her, and that was the end of the Amazon force at Troy, because everything that army was doing depended on her being alive. In the longer poetic version, she and Achilles exchange words first, and she throws twice, and both weapons come off his shield, and he mocks her, and then he strikes. Her horse goes down with her, and as she falls he catches the shaft, or catches her, depending on the line, and pins them both. She was still alive when he took hold of the helmet to pull it off, because it was the custom to take the armor, and because he wanted to see what he had killed. And that is the moment the whole story exists for. Under the helmet was a face that stopped him. The poet who wrote the longest account of it says the beauty in that face was glorious and terrible at once, that even lying there dying in the dust with the blood coming, she was so lovely that every Greek standing around her went quiet and privately wished his own wife at home looked like that. And Achilles, who 12 days earlier had refused to make an agreement with a dying man and had told him the dogs would have him, stood there holding a helmet and fell in love with the woman he had just put a spear through. There is a version in which she looks up at him as it happens. The image the ancient painters kept coming back to, on vase after vase for 2 centuries, is the two of them at that exact instant, his face down close to hers, her eyes finding his. The gods get a small share of the blame for it in one account, which says that Aphrodite made her more beautiful in death than she had been in life, deliberately, precisely so that the man who had killed her would have to carry it. He grieved for her openly. He said, in front of the army, that he wished he had not done it, that he would rather have taken her home to his own country as his wife, and that she was flawless and tall as a goddess, and that he had wasted something the world was not going to make again. Not everyone was moved. There was a man in the Greek camp called Thersites, who is remembered as the ugliest man who came to Troy, and the one with the worst mouth, and whose function in every scene he appears in is to say out loud the sour thing everyone else is thinking. He stood over the body and mocked Achilles for weeping over a dead enemy. He said it was disgraceful. He said it was lust, and he said what kind. And then, in the crueler version of the story, he took the point of his spear and put out her eyes while Achilles was standing there. Achilles killed him. One blow. In some accounts, a single punch that broke his jaw and his skull and killed him where he stood. And that should have been the end of it, and it was not, because Thersites had a cousin in the camp, and the cousin was Diomedes, one of the great Greek captains. And Diomedes, denied any way to take revenge on Achilles, took it on the corpse instead. He had Penthesilea's body tied and dragged and thrown into the river, so that neither side would ever be able to bury her. Achilles went into the water and brought her out, and then he did what he had refused to do for Hector until an old man came and knelt in front of him. He gave her a funeral. Some say he handed her back to the Trojans, who buried her with honor near the city, and some say he burned her himself in the Greek camp with her armor beside her. Either way, she went into the ground properly, and he was the one who saw to it. He had to leave for a while afterward, to the island of Lesbos, to be purified for killing Thersites, because even in the 10th year of a war there were rules about murdering your own. He came back, and there was very little time left. Another champion arrived to help Troy almost at once, Memnon out of Ethiopia, the son of the dawn goddess, in armor made by the same god who had made Achilles's, and he killed Nestor's son, and Achilles killed him for it, and his mother wept for him in a way the world still sees every morning. And then Achilles pushed too far. He drove the Trojans in through the gates, and went in after them, up under the wall, into the one place he had told Patroclus never to go. An arrow came off the tower, Paris shot it, and Apollo guided it, exactly as a dying man had promised him, 12 days and 1 lifetime earlier. It went into his heel, into the one part of him his mother's hands had been holding when she dipped him as an infant, the one place the river had never touched. The greatest fighter in the world was killed by the worst one in the war, from a distance, with a bow. Ajax carried the body out over his shoulder, with Odysseus holding off the Trojans behind him, and they burned him and mixed his ashes with the ashes of Patroclus in one jar, which had been the arrangement all along. Then the Greeks argued about who should get his armor. Ajax had carried him. Odysseus had spoken better. They gave it to Odysseus, and Ajax, who had held the ships alone on the worst day of the war, went out that night, intending to murder the men who had voted, and Athena put madness on him so that he slaughtered a herd of livestock instead. And when the madness lifted at dawn, and he saw what he had done and what the whole camp had seen him do, he set his sword in the ground and fell on it. So in the space of a few weeks Troy lost Hector, Penthesilea and Memnon, and the Greeks lost Achilles and Ajax, Both sides were hollowed out. The war had eaten every hero it had. And it still could not be won, because the walls were still standing, and after 10 years the Greeks had never once got over them. So Odysseus stopped thinking about walls, and started thinking about gates, and about who opens them. There were conditions on the fall of Troy, and the Greeks had spent the last year of the war quietly satisfying them one by one. A captured Trojan seer had told them what those conditions were. They needed the bow of Heracles, which meant fetching a man they had abandoned on an island 9 years earlier, with a festering wound and every reason to hate them, and persuading him to come. They did. They needed Achilles' son, a boy called Neoptolemus, who had never seen the war, and they went and got him out of his grandfather's house and brought him to the beach. And they needed the Palladium, an ancient wooden image of Athena that stood inside Troy and that protected the city as long as it remained there. Odysseus and Diomedes went over the wall in the dark and stole it. None of that opened the gates. It only made the last move possible. The horse was Odysseus's idea, and a craftsman named Epeius built it, and the thing they made was enormous, a hollow wooden horse on a wheeled base, big enough to hold a raiding party in its belly, with a hatch cut into the side and a ladder inside. Then the whole Greek army burned its camp and put to sea. That was the essential part, and it was the part that made the trick work. The Trojans did not wake up to find a horse. They woke up to find the beach empty. 10 years of tents and cook fires and ships drawn up along the shore, and now nothing but ash pits and the marks of hulls in the sand, and one object standing on the shore in the morning light. The fleet was not far. It was anchored behind the island of Tenedos, just over the horizon, waiting for a fire signal. The Trojans came out of their city and walked down to the beach and stood where the Greek camp had been. There are lines describing them wandering about the abandoned ground, pointing out where each contingent had been, standing in the space where Achilles' shelter had stood. 10 years of dread lifted off them in a single morning, and if you want to understand why they made the decision they made next, that is where it starts. They were not stupid. They were people who had just been told the siege was over. There was an argument about the horse. Some said burn it. Some said take an axe to it and see what was inside. And some said drag it up to the citadel and dedicate it, because it was clearly an offering to a goddess, and it would be an offense to destroy it. The priest Laocoon came down and said the thing everyone remembers, that he feared the Greeks, and feared them most of all when they were handing out gifts. And he took a spear and threw it hard into the flank of the horse, and it struck, and the whole hollow body rang, and the sound that came out of it was the sound of a great empty box with something in it. They heard that, and they did not act on it, because at exactly that moment some shepherds arrived dragging a prisoner. Sinon had let himself be caught. That was his entire job, and he had volunteered for it, and it required a nerve that is difficult to overstate. He was tied and beaten and brought in front of the king and the crowd, and he told them a long story. The story was that the Greeks had wanted to sail home, and that the gods had demanded a human sacrifice for a fair wind, exactly as they had at Aulis 10 years before, and that the man chosen had been him. That Odysseus had arranged it out of malice, that he had broken his bonds on the night before and hidden in a marsh while the fleet sailed without him, and that he had nothing left in the world and no home to go back to. He wept while he said it. He cursed the name of Odysseus with real feeling, which is what sold it, because the Trojans hated Odysseus, and a man who hated him too could not be entirely an enemy. And Priam untied him. Then they asked about the horse, and Sinon told them the second half of it. He said it was built as an offering to Athena, in atonement for the theft of the Palladium, which the Trojans knew perfectly well had happened. He said the Greeks had been ordered to build it enormous on purpose, so that it could never be brought inside the walls. And he said that if the Trojans ever did get it inside, the protection that had been stolen from them would pass back to their city, and Troy would be safe forever. It was a beautiful lie, because it turned the size of the thing from a warning into a dare. They were still weighing it when the sea moved. 2 serpents came in over the water in coils, and came up the beach and went straight for Laocoon's 2 young sons, and took them in front of him, and when he ran to them, took him as well. And then the snakes went up to the shrine of Athena and coiled at the goddess's feet. The Trojans watched that and read it exactly backwards. The man who had thrown a spear at a sacred offering had been destroyed by the goddess that offering belonged to. That is what it looked like. It could not have looked like anything else. So they took down part of their own wall to get the horse through, and they put ropes on it, and they hauled it up into the city, and there were children walking alongside it singing. 4 times on the way up the incline the thing stopped, and something inside it clashed, armor against armor, and every time they heard it, they kept pulling. And a woman was screaming from the steps of the temple. Cassandra had been given true prophecy by Apollo and then, for refusing him, had been cursed so that no one would ever believe a word of it. She stood in the middle of a celebrating city and told them precisely what was inside the horse and what would happen that night, and they went past her. They put garlands up all over the town. They feasted, and at some point long after dark, a city that had not slept properly in 10 years slept. Sinon opened the hatch. The men came down the ladder into the dark of the citadel, and out on Tenedos, the signal fire went up on the highest point of the island, and the fleet came back across a flat sea with muffled oars, and the men in the horse walked down and opened the gates from the inside for an army that was already on the beach. What happened after that was not a battle. Nobody who was there ever described it as one. The old man who lived through it, telling it years later, could not tell it in order. He jumps from place to place, from a street to a rooftop to a courtyard, in short broken pieces, because that is how it happened to him. He woke to a noise he did not understand. He went up onto the roof and saw fire in a quarter of the city, and did not yet know why. He came down into a street and found people running past him in both directions. There was no line, no front, no command. There was a city with an army loose inside it in the middle of the night. Some Trojans fought. A group of them took armor off dead Greeks and put it on and moved through the streets killing, until other Trojans saw Greek armor in the dark and killed them, and then the surviving Greeks caught them too, and the whole idea died with the men who had it. The palace went last. They came at it with a battering ram and up ladders against the walls, and the defenders tore the roof apart and threw the beams and the gilded rafters of their own ancestral hall down on the men coming up. It bought minutes. Then the doors went, and Neoptolemus came in. Priam was very old. He had fathered 50 sons and had buried most of them. When the noise reached the inner court, he put on armor he had not worn in decades, and his wife found him doing it and told him it was madness, and made him come and sit with her at the altar in the middle of the courtyard, under an old laurel, where the household gods were, because nobody kills a man at an altar. One of his last surviving sons came running into that courtyard wounded, with Neoptolemus behind him, and was killed in front of his parents. And Priam stood up and said what he could. He told the son of Achilles that his father had not behaved like this, that Achilles had respected a suppliant, that Achilles had given Hector's body back, that he had let an old man kneel in his shelter and had wept with him and sent him home safely. He said, "You are not his son." And he threw a spear, which did not have the strength behind it to do anything at all, and it hung on the boy's shield. Neoptolemus took him by the hair, dragged him across his own courtyard through his son's blood, and killed him at the altar. That was the end of Troy, not the walls. The old man at the altar. The rest of that night is a list of things that should not have been possible. Hector's infant son was taken from his mother and thrown from the walls, because a Greek seer had said that if he lived, he would rebuild the city. Cassandra was dragged out of the temple of Athena with her hands still on the statue by a man who bore the same name as one of the great heroes, and none of the character, and the goddess never forgave it, and the whole Greek fleet paid for that one act on the way home. Achilles' ghost was said to have demanded a girl at his tomb, and Priam's youngest daughter was given to him. Hecuba, who had been queen of the richest city on that coast that morning, was a slave by dawn. A few got out. Aeneas came down out of the burning upper town, carrying his father on his back with his son holding his hand, and lost his wife in the streets, and went back for her, and found only her shade, who told him to stop, that she was not meant to go, and that there was land waiting for him a long way west. He took the household gods of Troy out through a gate, and up into the hills, and looked back once at the light on the sky, and went on. That thread runs all the way to the founding of another city on another river, and the Romans never stopped telling it, because it made them the survivors, rather than the strangers. The Greeks loaded the ships with everything the city had, and burned what was left, and the fire on that headland could be seen from the islands, and almost none of them got home well. Agamemnon walked into his own hall in Mycenae, and was murdered before he had washed. Ajax the Lesser was drowned. Menelaus and Helen wandered for years. Odysseus took 10 more years and arrived alone, having lost every man he sailed with. The victory cost the winners as completely as the defeat cost the losers, which is, in the end, the point the Greeks kept making about war every single time they told a story about one. 3 times the earth had risen against the sky, and the sky had held. Wine had turned a wedding hall into a killing floor. A boy had gone down into the dark with a piece of string and come back. A hunt had eaten a royal house. 7 men had come to 7 gates and 1 had ridden away. And a city that had stood against everything for 10 years came down in one night because somebody was kind to a liar. The plain is empty now. The mound where Achilles was burned is still out there under the grass. And the walls came down long ago, and the shore has moved so far from the old harbour that a fleet could not anchor where 1,000 ships once did. But the stories held, every one of them. Long after the temples went quiet, long after anyone left flowers for Athena, the old wars kept being told in rooms like the one you are in now, by voices like this one, to people lying in the dark. Sleep well, the fighting is over.